Hi, Matt.
Hey,
Hello
how
there.
you doing?
Welcome.
Thank you.
Good to have you.
Well, we'll see, I guess, but yeah.
Nice.
I like your shirt.
Yeah.
Oh, this is one of these things that the evolved fish people did. It's kind of
Nice. That's cool. That's cool.
Make of it what you will, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of nicely ambiguous. So
Yeah. It's great. Well, thanks for joining us, Matt.
oh, you're welcome. Hopefully, Abby will be along. I think she was expecting to, but just keep an eye out for her.
Okay. Yeah. As soon as she clicks on the link, I'll get a little.
Yeah. Yeah. She has the link. So
Cool.
all right.
Hi there, Matthew. I'm Kollibri.
Hello.
Nikki's
Nice
right
to
here
meet
too.
you. Uh-huh.
Nice to meet you. Yeah. So I've got the podcast Voices for Nature and Peace. And today the episode with your wife just went up online for people to see
Right.
with Juliet. So you might have
Okay.
seen that.
I'm aware of it. I'm looking forward to actually listening to it at some point. We don't spend a lot of time talking to each other about these things anymore.
Oh, I'm sure.
So it'll be kind of fun to see how they
Right.
play out. But,
Cool. And I often use video to go with my podcasts too.
Okay.
So I'll do an audio version and then I'll do a video version. So I'm just mentioning the video version because of the other person you said might be coming on. So I don't know if you told her that she might get recorded. So.
I think it's something that if she comes up with, we'll need to tell her. But I told her it was sort of up to her and you guys how much she was involved. I mean, she could just go into audio only, but she's working on a podcast for her project, and so I just thought
cool.
it would be helpful. I thought it would be helpful for her to watch this happen.
Oh yeah, she's totally welcome to be here. As far as I'm concerned, I just wanted to mention that about the recording in case she didn't know about that. So
Absolutely.
Well, I didn't know that it would be recorded.
Yeah, you didn't know that either.
Video.
So
yeah.
So you can also say you don't want us to use the video and I'll use only the audio. That's fine too.
Should I get a different shirt? I mean, we don't want to make
No,
this
you're
more
not
complicated than it needs to be.
Don't worry about that.
I'm saying, we're drawing in issues that don't necessarily help here, but they may not hurt, but it's just a matter of complications. It's up to you. It's your podcast, so here we are.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, we've been really trying to cover a lot of ground on these issues, and the thing is about with today, people's mentality today is when you have a university title under your name, people are all ears all of a sudden, so it's like we've talked to quite a few people about these things, and then how people are with that.
Well, it's different, but depending on what you say, if you start saying things that they don't like, they'll still find a reason not to like it, and then they'll get their facts from their people.
Yeah.
True.
Totally.
Well, Gabe,
I have
whenever you are, if you want to jump in with the first questions or however you want to start this.
I'm ready. So yeah,
Okay.
Everybody, thank you for joining us. This is really awesome. I'm really glad that Kollibri and I have kind of joined here, and Nikki's with us. And so yeah, this is a big conversation, and I think really a great place to start, and why your work interests me, Matt, is your perspective as a historian and an ecologist, and I think that to kind of start from ground zero here, let's just cover some of the historical basis around invasion biology and just like the current narratives and stories in our culture, and what the origins of these stories are, the origin story of invasion biology, and some of the old heads in the game that kind of have put certain things out there that have then become kind of cultural ethos in relationship to how we relate to the land and certain plants, and So yeah, could you just start off by just giving us like a little and our listeners a little lowdown on like who you are and what you study and in the context of invasion biology and how you're kind of known as a critique of invasion biology in many ways, which is pretty cool.
I think, who am I? I'm a bird watcher gone horribly wrong. I mean, I started out as a child who liked animals, right? And but more proximately, I studied things like environmental interpretation when I was an undergrad in college, which was primarily supposed to be preparation for being like a park naturalist. It was great because I got to take all kinds of courses that I would have taken for fun, and I didn't have to take a lot of courses that I wasn't interested in. So a lot of sort of organism and species and natural history based things. From there, I went into environmental consulting actually for a while and learned all about a lot of laws like the National Environmental Policy Act and the Endangered Species Act to deal with those for various clients. And my clients were private, or they were state highway departments, or they were the Department of Defense. And it was quite an array of things to do. From there, I went to work for Arizona State Parks, where I was called a natural resources planner and was basically their interagency coordinator for any kind of biology troubleshooting sort of stuff. So I spent a lot of time in meetings and occasionally, could check out a vehicle and go anywhere in Arizona and go bird watching or something like that. Always with a purpose, but I always had the binoculars. I eventually sort of being contrarian in many ways, made myself less than welcome at Arizona State Parks. Mm-hmm. And about the same time, I was working a lot on natural areas issues. We had a state natural areas program, and the state natural areas program was created by citizen initiative. And so whatever was written into that law was written from a sort of collective environmentalist conception of how the world ought to work in Arizona. And finding ways to make that function was always interesting. And there were lots of things about it that were kind of at odds with very traditional management, of course. And then there were lots of things that were at odds with sort of up and coming ecological ideas. So we were caught somewhere in the middle in a way, and trying to find ways to do that, because there was money involved. There was money appropriated for this purpose of acquiring natural areas, and how to come up with a way to use that money was not always simple. The Parks Board needed some kind of policy, something consistent that they could point to, but they didn't always necessarily want to follow a policy that was produced by sort of semi-academic thinkers, because it was political too. It was really a complicated thing. Mm-hmm. It was during that natural areas period that I really got interested in the problem of what belongs where. Okay, I was hearing the idea of invasive species was ramping up in the 1990s as a big issue. People were kind of glomming onto this one as, oh yeah, I feel this problem, and so it gained a lot of traction. It gained a lot of support. It made a lot of noise, and the more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed to me. And so that's when I kind of bailed on all of the attempt to manage and decided I needed to figure this out for myself. Mm. And that became understanding those ideas through a sort of a historical process was my PhD project, and there was a hole there. There was a hole to fill in the understanding of where these ideas came from and how they developed and all of that. And I thought it was going to be a story that started in the 1950s when I set out to do it, because everyone was telling me that it was a story that started in the 1950s. But I found it starting in about 1600. So it got to be a much different project than what I had kind of imagined at first, but it was fun because, again, it was a place that really nobody had dug into this to figure out what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So and I'm still doing it. So I got my PhD in 2006 at the tender age of 49. I beat 50 to a PhD.
Mm-hmm.
And have been kind of carrying on this conversation or argument, as it often becomes, ever since.
Yeah.
So what was the actual name of your
Of my dissertation?
Or yeah. Mm-hmm.
The actual name of my dissertation, and it's sitting on the shelf right behind me here, and it's about 300 pages long, is Ending with Elton, Preludes to Invasion Biology. Because instead of beginning in 1958, I ended there. I got to the point where I thought I was going to start, and had already, completed a massive project. So the Elton there is Charles Elton, who's often referred to as sort of one of the fathers of animal ecology, really, but more recently he's had been invoked quite a bit as sort of the initiator of invasion biology, which isn't really accurate either, but a lot of things aren't accurate.
Yeah. And some of these other bigger names like E.O. Wilson, I think, is one of the major names that kind of really influenced the current perspectives on this. Could you speak a little bit to Wilson's influence after Elton?
Wilson really, so Elton, to contextualize Elton a little bit, Elton knew Aldo Leopold, and Rachel Carson asked him to write the foreword to the British edition of Silent Spring. So he was not unknown. He was a big deal. Elton was central to ecology from the 1930s well into the 1950s. And his ideas about conservation were very similar to Leopold's. They kind of wrote two different versions of the same thing. So Wilson was just pretty much a student around the time that Elton was writing The Ecology of Invasions by Animals and Plants. And Wilson wasn't really heavily into environmental issues or conservation issues at all for a very long time. So when he finally did do that, which was not until around 1980, when he began to first sort of write with a conservation angle, and then it took a while for his ideas to develop, but ultimately he put in one of his books, and I've got way too much stuff that I'm sorting through in my head right now, but I think it was The Future of Life, or whether that was just the chapter name or the book name, I don't remember. So this is around 19.
Diversity of Life, is that the one that is?
Yeah, maybe. So it was around 1986 or something like that. So he made a very short case for the idea that introduced species were a problem. And he based it all on a set of papers by some North American freshwater fish biologists they had written 3 sort of interlocking papers about fish conservation and had put in there a lot of a lot of anecdote. I mean, they had based what they were saying a lot on anecdotal information because there wasn't really a lot of data. So it was a lot of it was just based on the impressions that people had about what was happening to the taxa that they were studying. What's happening, you know, what one guy says happens over here and what she says it happens over there, and in these cases. And so there's it's built up a lot of anecdote. And but he made a very sort of categorical claim then about introduced species being a problem, right? This was not a peer-reviewed book. This was by the point in time when Wilson could just sort of, you know, write something and a publisher would take it and nobody's going to fact check it or, you know, do anything like that. And it became not in itself sort of the be all and end all of this, but it was one of the sort of root statements for modern purposes, for people that most of us know about. And it was Edward O. Wilson, and so that was important because Wilson was important. And it became the basis of, you know, further work and other claims. Most of and like pages about this crazy kind of recursive process of people citing people who had cited them until it just became known. It became the thing to say that invasive exotic species are the second greatest threat to biodiversity, whatever that means. Mm-hmm. So Wilson definitely had a piece of this, and he has never backed off of it as far as I know. I've talked to him about it. I've sat next to him and tried to have a conversation about it, and he didn't necessarily engage.
Yeah, it's been surprising to me. It's not so surprising anymore, but trying to look into some of the history or where these claims come from, that they're really typically based on one statement or on a few studies. Like, it seems to be a reoccurring theme if I follow papers references a few times.
One of the really most cited, actually literally the most cited paper ever in the history of the journal Bioscience, which is the journal of the American Institute of Biological Sciences, which institutions belong to, individuals belong to, agencies belong to. This is a sort of a coordinating group in biology in America. So in Bioscience, in their journal, there was in 1998, 1999, there was an article that came out quantifying threats to something, to I don't remember if it was endangered species or threatened species. I think it was or imperiled or something like that.
Quantifying threats to species imperiled in the United States. Was that the Wilcove?
Or Pimentel.
Wilcove et al. Yeah. So quantifying threats. This is the most cited paper ever in the history of bioscience. And several of us who have, you know, kind of taken on the task of analyzing all the rhetoric of this, truly wonder whether most of the people who have cited that paper have ever read it. Mm-hmm. But that's not actually unusual for things that become sort of citation classics. There's almost a tradition of having to cite certain things to sort of raise your hand and say, me too. Yeah. Whether you know, it's part of acknowledging that you're part of the group or accepting membership in this particular club. And this, I mean, that sounds kind of shocking if you think science is above all that, but it's not. And to get by just the first layer of peer review, sometimes it's as simple as that. The first thing a reviewer will do is go to the bibliography and see who you're citing.
Mm.
Which is something that is really, like, I wanted to bring it up from, like, when I've read your papers, you talked about the kind of, you've alluded a little bit to the fallibility of our God, like in God faith in peer review, in the peer review, you know, and how, like, if it's peer reviewed, then people, like, don't think to question it or follow the trail, the paper trail and the citation trail, and, like, actually read in past the abstract and the conclusion of a paper and actually read into all of the paper and the data and stuff. And you mentioned in one of your papers how Wilson's claim, which was drawn from, you know, basically anecdotal opinions about freshwater fish species, basically got accepted immediately into peer-reviewed circles. And then that created this kind of positive feedback loop that, like, since it was in the peer review loop, it hasn't really seemed to leave yet, because people have, like, this faith in peer review, in the peer review. And I'm not, like, denigrating, like, the value of peer review, but I think it's also just, like, good to acknowledge that, yeah, you've kind of pointed out the fallibility in, like, and not in, like, how it's important to take it with a grain of salt and actually do your own research and, like, follow the paper trails and stuff.
Science is a human endeavor, and all of the things that humans are susceptible to can be found there. That's why we have lots of people who are historians of science, or sociologists of science, or philosophers of science. There should be a psychology of science out there somewhere, because it's definitely people doing things. And there are millions, literally now, there are millions of peer-reviewed papers published every year. And in order to stay sort of relevant and on the cutting edge of whatever kind of subdiscipline anyone's offering, there's a certain amount of just having to take authority. I'm not sure that we would say take it on faith, but take authority as read. And it's a well-known problem that very few experimental studies ever get replicated to see if somebody else gets the same results. I mean, even if the data are made available and all the procedures are well understood, just replicating someone else's study is not really necessarily a way to move forward in academia. It's really necessary, but it just doesn't get done as much as it should. And these are the kind of problems that are sort of discussed internally in science, but people don't necessarily want to sort of hang this washing out for everybody to see.
But this is a funding issue too, also, isn't it? Isn't it that people are less likely to get funded if all they're doing is replicating an older study, right?
Well, there's at least a perception of that. How do you making for are you making a knowledge so it's baked in to this whole process that you aren't just here to sort of check out what somebody else was doing. Your status, your tenure, your future kind of depends on being able to demonstrate that you are doing something new and relevant yourself. Mm-hmm. So it's a little ironic then that if you don't spend enough time checking out all of these foundation stones that you were building your ideas on, you could easily sort of wander off into some sort of strange cul-de-sac, dead end, whatever, because you've taken as given a certain set of ideas that then turn out maybe not to be as literally as foundational as you need them to be, right? And so it's somewhere we get onto where there's enough cognitive dissonance that part of this wall crumbles, and you have to sort of figure out how to fix it from there. Hopefully we're not running into too many hugely foundational mistakes about like the nature of matter and things like that. But some of this stuff in ecology is so full of contingencies. That's a good historian word. And of complexities that we can really rush to generalize a little too quickly in order to try and, because you want to make everybody wants to make a big general point. Just saying, well, I've just learned a whole lot more about this population of birds in this corner of Nevada or something like that is not as interesting or impressive as saying I've kind of got a new principle, if not a law of nature, or at least some kind of rule that everything follows.
Yeah. So yeah, that's actually it's a good segue into this question. We were all discussing last night, Nikki and Kollibri and I, of how much of invasion biology has its origin scientifically versus culturally,
and if they're even separable.
Yeah. Or institutionally even, right?
There's a lot going on there. The first, I think, the things that we have to kind of begin to take into account to understand this are ideas like what's a place, or ideas about what's a species, or ideas about what's an ecosystem, or what's a plant community. Which of these things are real things, and which of them are ideas that we are kind of building up in order to, as models, or as metaphors for these things that we see. How much of what we're doing, remember, ecology and economy come from that same root, that eco root, which is literally in Greek, the household. It's a study of so ecology would literally be sort of the study of the household. So there's a metaphor baked in right from the beginning, when Ernst Haeckel in 1866 or whenever said, this is ecology and this is what I'm going to think about this. Well, he thought about all kinds of things, and he had all kinds of interesting ideas, some of which were, from our perspective, plainly nuts. But that's the way science works, is we try nutty ideas, and some of them work and some of them don't. So it goes way back. But the first thinking about places and belonging was sort of inspired by Europeans starting to spread out across the world and finding themselves confronted with very different plants and animals than they were aware of, and living under very different conditions. And so to the extent that the old model was sort of the Genesis biblical creation, how did all of this fit into that narrative? These were things that just weren't mentioned. These were places that weren't mentioned. These were sort of natural histories that were, how do we use this as a natural theology kind of way to understand what we have understood about ourselves so far. So by about the 1830s, there was this idea that was starting to get some discussion when people were realizing that not all the plants that are here, wherever here is, not all the plants that are here now have always been here. Mm-hmm. And we can begin making the case that some of them are here because people brought them here. And so even the plants that we were farming, so we're thinking about Britain now, because this is where this is kind of the evidence is for this kind of thinking. So in Britain, you're trying to grow wheat, or you're trying to grow whatever your crop is. And people are saying, well, where did this come from originally? And there's enough exploration going on. Oh, well, they're growing wheat over there, and they're growing wheat over there. And people begin thinking about, so how did it come from over there? And all of that. And then other just sort of empirical process was improving, and the ability to distinguish different kinds of plants was improving. Taxonomy was coming along as a new thing. People were talking to each other across space about, we have that over here too, right? So where do these plants live? How big an area do they live in, and how much, where is the edge? Where is the edge of where they can live, and why? And which of the things that are around, kind of growing around the house here, out in the garden, are growing here because we brought them in, or some of our precursors, or some of, which of these things are here because people are here, and which of these things are here because they just are spontaneous productions of this place. There's a lot of complication going on. And so people were making floras, they were making lists of the plants that grew anywhere in particular, and comparing those lists. So this just became a big hobby. This was before botany really became professional, right? This was something that people who had time on their hands and the wherewithal to do it could go out and do it for fun. And so a lot of the early botanists were very much just hobbyists. After the people who had to be botanists because they were looking for medicinal stuff, which was all throughout any history that anybody could recall, then now there's this new kind of botany where people are just doing this for fun. And they got way into it. I mean, there's serious dilettantes at this. But as that developed, and it also became a more academic thing too, as some of these will, people were trying to decide how to annotate their floras, their lists of plants, to make it clear which of the plants seem to be here now, this place plants that have always been here, whether God put them here or whether, however they got here, they didn't get here because people brought them in. That was, we've got this dichotomy between the human and natural that is sort of really familiar to everyone. And that formed the basis of this. Okay, so these things that we think someone brought in, we have some evidence to suggest that they have this human history of transportation. And we're going to mark those somehow. So the list tended to start developing various kinds of asterisks and daggers and other kind of little marks that were stuck on them and explained elsewhere. Finally, somebody said, well, I'm just going to take this idea of some ideas out of English common law and apply them to this. And this was the moment when he said, I'm going to use native this way. Native used to just mean spontaneously occurring. It didn't have anything to do with deep origins. It just meant that anything that was native was just out there. It's there when you got them, and it's just out there, and nobody planted it, nobody husbanded it, however you want to put that. But he said, I'm going to take native to mean there's no evidence that people moved it. Thus, it's presumably a local production because we have no evidence of anything else. These other things that people brought in, I'm going to call alien, because that's the term we use for people who are crossing borders. And that's the moment. I mean, this guy whose name was Hewitt Cottrell Watson, H.C. Watson, who had been educated as a lawyer, educated as a doctor, and didn't do either one of them because he didn't have to, because he inherited enough money to just go on and do his other thing. And he had 7 older sisters that he had to figure out how to marry off. And But he was, he had the money, and this was his deep interest. He'd gotten into it when he was learning medicine. But he says, okay, so I know these legal terms, and I'm going to take these and a few others, and I'm going to apply them to the botanical things. So we have a way to talk about this now. 1847, and it's stuck. And it's stuck through the Darwinian Revolution. It's stuck through all of genetics. It's stuck through the whole history of biology as we know it, really, because most of what we know of from biology kind of happened after that. Somehow this idea survived through all of those events and remained actually untouched into the present day. It's the same idea. Either people moved it here or they didn't.
Mm-hmm.
So it's still this dichotomy between human agency and some kind of other, nature.
And so his interest in applying these labels was just academic, basically, or?
Yes, it was primarily. Watson, in everything I've been able to find, never spent time saying this should not have happened.
Right.
This is a bad thing. He was making a point about, and this is sort of following on work that was done by Alexander von Humboldt. Lots of natural in the central Alexander von Humboldt and Humboldt's ideas about how things growing or living in a place were sort of expressions of some important aspect, some important reality about that. So you go somewhere and you make a list of all the things you see, and those are expressing that place. But if people are bringing them in, then that's messing up that, it's obscuring that expression somehow a little bit. But Watson was just trying to find a way to talk about these because there was no vocabulary yet. And he also, because making lists, making floras, and doing like sort of creating phytogeography, the plant geography, creating maps of plants, was part of his thing. There was a lot of sort of competitiveness in this game among dilettante amateur naturalists. And he sat at the center of sort of a exchange program of specimens from all over Great Britain. People would press the same way we if you've ever seen a herbarium sample, the same way we now dry and press plants. He was one of the people who sort of developed part of that practice and standardized how labels should be done and all of those things. And he suspected often that some of these people were actually moving plants to new places themselves and then claiming to have discovered them. So he was more worried about this. He was more worried about this aspect of it than he was worried about the fact that there were plants that people had introduced per se, and that he wasn't worried about there being some sort of violation of nature by doing this. He was more worried about people trying to take credit for things that they shouldn't really be taking credit for.
And this was around the time of the whole acclimatization societies, when the English colonial globalizing power was literally moving plant species all over the globe. There was and the acclimatization societies, that was like their quest to move as many species around the globe as possible. And it was kind of in conjunction with as the English basically colonized and started to globalize all of these different places around the world. There was an economic plantation motive. And so they were in the motive of the acclimatization society. They were moving plants to different places where they could basically create a cash crop of something that would grow there, and then basically create a business monopoly on that and enslave the local people to grow it. And, Does that, you know what I'm talking about? And then
I do, but I want to make a point about that. That the original acclimatization societies were basically homesick people who were trying to find ways to grow the stuff they had at home.
yeah.
And so the empire building is definitely one aspect of empire building. I mean, so the problem of colonial powers was that, they grabbed and controlled what territory they could, but they didn't always grab the territory that had the plant or animals materials to exploit in a big way. So there was a lot of sort of bio prospecting and bioespionage going on, where people were moving from one colonial, places controlled by one colonial power to another, trying to get hold of these things and smuggle them and move them around. And it was going on certainly before the 19th century and on continuing well into the 19th century, depending on who was at war with whom, and even into the 20th century. I mean, with World War II, there was concern about where are we going to get rubber. So creating new rubber plantations outside the ones that had become, inaccessible, unavailable, was a thing even into the middle of the 20th century. But and stories like Mutiny on the Bounty, if that's like, well, what does that got to do with anything? Well, the Bounties, that was a real story, and the Bounty's cargo, if I remember correctly, were breadfruit trees. They were being moved because breadfruit was one of those things, to go back to your point, that would provide a staple diet for people who were forced into labor or literally completely enslaved in the process.
Yeah.
So this was definitely going on, but acclimatization per se was kind of a more interesting thing than just how do we best impose the empire on these people. It was a lot of it started out was this, can we get the stuff we're familiar with to grow here?
Yeah, they missed their English gardens, and they wanted to bring the English gardens around the world with them. And yeah, that's really interesting, because the which I do want to kind of get some historical context. Like this, you're kind of alluding to it, where you said, like, alluding to your paper of ending with Elton, you said this history goes back to the 1600s. Could you expand on that a little bit and give us like some historical context off of like what you kind of just talked about?
In order for this whole thing to become an issue at all, you need to have people traveling pretty long distances relatively quickly. And that became possible with developments in seafaring primarily. There was a lot of, as ships became more dependable, faster, literally higher tech. There's still sailing ships, but the possibility of going anywhere in the world, once people figured out that there was that you could go out there and head off in some direction and land somewhere else, as the idea of the Earth as a sphere was very, very old, actually. But now that it was sort of practically demonstrated, and people were getting in ships and heading off to see what they could find, to see if they could find quicker ways to get to places they already knew about. Well, if we go this way, we know we can get to India, but we have to go all the way around Africa, and that's a pain. So what happens if we go the other way? Can we get to India, right? So this is what Columbus was trying to do. And gradually they were mapping the world in the process. But so the technology is getting better. People are surviving these voyages. They're bringing materials back with them from longer distances quicker. which means that anything that sort of latches onto the ship in the process is also making this voyage. Anything that's in the ballast, and at the time ballast was the dry material, was usually rocks, because your cargo wasn't always particularly massive or weighty enough to keep your ship upright. So they were adjusting things with inert materials, and inert materials are often not completely inert, right? So there's stuff in there besides the rocks. There's seeds, there's eggs, there's whatever of insects and things like that. And you get to the next port and you change your cargo, and you've got to add ballast or remove ballast, and you weren't allowed to throw the ballast in the water because that would just fill up the docks with rocks. So it all had to be taken out and dumped up on the hillside somewhere. And so things started growing out of this material that had not been seen before, right? Because there's just seeds in there. And as early as around, well, the publication of this was actually in like 1626, but so Francis Bacon had correspondents who were Italian botanists, and he didn't really specify who he was talking to when he mentions that there are these new plants growing out of the ballast heaps. And so, like, what's this about? It's just more raising the question, but the observations were being made that there was stuff that was, let's say, I would call unmanifested cargo. It's not on the list anywhere, but it turns up, at the other end of the voyage. So this is the earliest I've seen good discussions of the sort of long distance movement. But part of the problem is before this, plants, local plants and animals were well enough known in practical terms to the people who encountered them all the time, but there was not a science of this. There was not an overarching taxonomy or inventory of what we would later, maybe call biodiversity. So it was quite a confluence of there becoming enough information that people could actually talk about this and be sure they were talking about the same things or compare specimens. All of that stuff had to be happening before you could even know whether something was new, right? You couldn't, well, I've never seen it. Have you ever seen it? No. Well, I guess we've just never seen it. That would be one way to approach this because, because there's just no underlying database to work from. Once the data started collecting and people started developing particular expertise in these things, and they could send materials to each other and say, is this what are we talking about the same thing? And so this is the kind of practice that had to be in place before people could even begin to have these conversations. So yeah, as there's more sort of literally more globalization in trade within and between these empires, there is more stuff being moved as a result, inadvertently or on purpose. We always, this is one of those things you'll see kind of as just a repeated little statement you'll find in discussions of introduced species is it's important for some reason whether it was moved on purpose or whether it was an accident.
It's really arbitrary.
And well, it is, but it isn't, because if we moved it on purpose and it did what we wanted it to, it's fine, it's not a problem. Think of the whole United States Midwest covered in 2 or 3 crops, primarily.
Right. Corn,
wheat, soybeans.
Yeah.
We brought those over from somewhere else. We put them in the ground here. They did what we wanted. They're great. They've wiped whole ecosystems off the map in the process of being tended by people like us, but that's not a problem because they're corn, wheat, and soybeans, and they're, we eat those and they're fine. So there is actually something going on in there. Yeah. It's when you introduce something and it doesn't behave the way you expect it to, that you can then start blaming it for being a bad actor. Even though, it's not like it was, despite the common um, metaphor of these things as hitchhikers or stowaways,
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure no plant or animal has ever stuck out a thumb and stopped a ship or a car and said, "Hey, buddy," and and certainly they haven't gotten on a ship hoping to be carried away somewhere else, because that requires a really complex set of comprehensions, to even imagine that I'm here, much less that I could be somewhere else and have then some method for getting there. That's all really complicated stuff, but we throw those metaphors around like, oh yeah, that plant's a hitchhiker, or that bivalve is a hitchhiker. I was just reading something, a report that some zebra mussels showed up on some plants that were being imported for the aquarium trade. And here in a federal database, it says they're hitchhiking. Really? Okay, well, that's a way to think about it, but I don't see it.
Yeah.
I think that something that comes up for me in these conversations about thinking about plants and animals moving more is that I feel like we're still leaving out the part of pre-European history and categorization. Like, there's other people who can speak better to this than I can, but plants were moving with people before Europeans were finding these ways of talking about plants moving. Like if we think about the Polynesian islands, those people came from far away to start colonizing them before modern, more technically advanced ships. And just on this continent, the places we've been investigating and curious about, seeing how so much of the landscape was tended, and some of these plants actually came from far away a long time ago. So I feel like that part of the conversation isn't brought in enough. Well, understanding that science is a human endeavor and it's full of bias and possibly inseparable from cultural perspectives, that seems like an important thing to bring forward talking about these things now too, is that it isn't actually anything new. Speeds, rates, and intention might be different, but I'm still not sure about any of that.
Well, I think that our general understanding of context has certainly changed over time. But absolutely, it's true that almost none of the major sort of crops that are grown around the world are primarily grown where their precursors evolved, right? So they have been moved a lot. And things that so in North America, things that we typically identify as our native crops, like corn, maize. Well, Squanto didn't find that growing wild and then just start planting some more of it. This stuff was traded up from Central America, where it was considerably altered in the process of some selective breeding, which may or may not have been particularly intentional, but it certainly had outcomes that were useful. There are very few crops if any, that we could think of in Arizona, where I live, that came from here, that were just developed here, right? They came from elsewhere. And that really wasn't understood. The beginnings of the understanding of all that didn't come until, I think around, I may get my decade wrong, but we can say into the latter half of the 19th century, people started looking at these things and saying, well, I wonder where that came from, and beginning to collect information, both from historical accounts from other parts of the world and just the evidence, the actual beginning of being able to collect evidence for some distant origin. And I think, and so that's actually a really pretty well developed endeavor to figure out this whole sort of biogeography thing, where stuff came from. But I don't think there's been much incentive to use it to say, well, that's really interesting, and that's just the way the world works, because there seems to be much more interest in finding ways to complain about the things we don't like and support those complaints with particular kinds of information or references. Because it really kind of starts with complaining about the things we don't like, and then looking for evidence to say, and here's why you should agree with me. It's not because you should dislike it too, but you should hate this thing for some other reason.
Yeah. Yeah, and inherent in this whole process from its inception seems this this insistence that, like you spoke to it, the human and nature dichotomy, that humans are separate from nature when really we're just another mammalian being, you know, and like and our capacity to move plants and modify our habitat and environment by moving around plants that are favorable to our cultural development and like health and well-being. You know, we're really just displaying our natural mammal behavior by doing that, you know, because we're like an inseparable part of like the ecology, the home, right? These places that we call home, you know. And that's like one of the difficult things about this conversation is that just like the misanthropic insistence that humans are separate from nature and that we're not like just another species, you know.
There's deep traditions in many cultures that explain why humans are different. It's really hard to find ways to, and whether overcoming that is what we're after or what, it's very hard to kind of overcome the, there's a lot going on here with power relationships and authority and who gets to say and who gets to benefit. I mean, these are really massive questions that all bear on the human condition, right? Yeah. So if we were to say that humans are evolved the same way anything else apparently evolved, through a process of natural selection, and we have a particular, often people say that humans are generalists, and there's this idea of the difference between generalists and specialists in the world, and there are some plants and animals that are highly specialized for something, and then there are others that are, you know, they're generalists in another way. Honestly, I think humans are highly specialized rather than being generalists. I think we're highly specialized to do a couple of things. And one of those is to imagine the future and imagine the outcome of, you know, to see processes and imagine what comes next. This is good old Sesame Street stuff. What happens next, you know? And then the other thing is we were fortunate to develop some capacity for manipulation, partly literally the manipulation of the hand, you know, and then by developing extensions, you know, of the hand, in effect, that are larger and smaller and all of that. So having these specializations of imagining a future, even if it's only a few seconds into the future or if it's way out into the future, having this future and this ability to manipulate, then what do we do? How do we get from here to there? This is our specialization. But we're not necessarily very good at unintended consequences, you know, trying to figure out how to keep something from happening as a an adjunct to whatever it was we had in mind. You can see that all around you all the time. It's relatively easy to create a machine. It's hard to keep that machine from not wearing out and breaking down sometime. And to think about that for a little while, and all sorts of problems begin to kind of come into focus. That we don't have a huge capacity to understand every outcome of something we're trying to do. We're focused on that thing we want to accomplish, and along the way, other stuff happens, and it all gets much more complicated than that.
Yeah.
I wanted to bring it back to the timeline of talking about how these concepts of native and alien, you talked about how they go back to the 1600s of observations of this, how in the 1850s was when we sort of drew out, okay, here's the two categories. But then at what level did the sort of demonization come in? I guess the first story I've heard about that was in the 30s, that the Germans were the first to sort of start demonizing plants that were not native.
I think it started much before that. I think it was not long after the idea of native and alien sort of were attached to the idea of introduced or not introduced. That this is as a Canadian ecologist named Brendan Larson, who looked into this, as one of the first people whose work was really useful for this purpose, where he just started looking into the metaphorical kind of composition of some of these ideas, and happened upon the idea of constitutive metaphors or root metaphors. It's kind of two ways of saying the same thing. And there are some metaphors that are so kind of powerfully associated in human minds that it's very hard to control them once they're out of the box. I'm sorry, I'm surrounded by dogs at the moment, so we're going to hear all kinds of interesting noises. But and this idea of the invader turns out to be sort of one of these metaphors that you cannot ever take you can't rid invader of all of its baggage and just say, well, I'm only talking about invasive in this very specific biological sense. It has nothing to do with people coming over the border with guns and tanks and doing something. It's just but no, you can never separate this idea of invasion successfully from bad intentions and sort of exercise of force and all of that stuff. Invasion, that's invasion, because if that's not invasion, then you need a different word. You cannot just say, I'm going to talk about invasion this way and don't ever think about it the other way while I'm saying it over and over again. So this is one of these very, very strong concepts that you can't peel out that important meaning from. So as soon as people are talking about this, then it begins to take on that kind of connotation. And I can find, when I was doing the dissertation research, I found a variety of people over time who would use it more that way, and other people who wouldn't necessarily go with those terms. And in fact, by the 1890s, there were already people who were thinking, we need a different set of words that is more objective. And so let's pick some root words out of Greek to use, because the Greek is going to be, a more scientific sounding kind of language. And so instead of aliens, we have neophytes. And the word neophyte has taken on a much broader sense, but neophyte is new plant, right? So this is the new plants versus the old plants. There's archaeophytes, the old plants. There's neophytes, and then there's there are huge numbers of different kind of fights that were already sort of in discussion. There are the plants that because all these fight words had to do with local adaptations, things that lived on rocks, things that lived underwater. You know, there's just fight, all these words.
And that's and just for listeners, that's P-H-Y-T-E.
Yes.
Not
Although
F-I-G-H-T, right.
I do have a file somewhere in my computer that has a list of all these, and I titled it Fight Song. But, yeah, so P-H-Y-T is the Greek for plant. So phyto. When we talk about phytoplankton, that's a word you might have heard. So phytoplankton is the non-animal part of plankton. It's the algae and stuff like that. And then there's zooplankton, right? So zoo is the Greek for animal, and phyto is for, not phyto like the dogs over here, but anyway. It gets out of control. Anyway, so but by 1900, there were people who were trying to find these other ways to talk about this that were not so fraught. So it was well underway. And so there's often a reference back to Nazi Germany and the fact that the Nazis were trying to, among all of the things they were trying to do, they were trying to create a more German, or return to a more German condition overall, which included the landscape. So it seems to be definitely part of the program was, but it's, I think, too closely. So Nazis, they were just one kind of people who came before and after, who had this idea of this place, our stuff, our correctness, and the attempt to sort of exercise control, return it to some previous, preferable, correct state, rather than accepting what was going on at the time. As just being part of an inevitable change. So just as an aside, do you want me to do something about the dogs, or are they causing a problem?
I think it's okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Then we'll let them do their thing.
Right.
How it is.
Right. So that's certainly another cultural, that starts to get us into all sorts of cultural areas when we talk about the original state of an area and how the original state might be good and all this. I mean, here we get into Greek ideas of a golden age. Here we get into a Garden of Eden ideal. I mean, to associate an older time with being the pure or the better one somehow, before a fall. I mean, just. We started this conversation talking about the cultural as well as the scientific elements related to, so-called invasion biology, and I'm just seeing that again here.
Yeah.
Well, I think, there's other places to find it. You can find it in the Wilderness Act. Right. This nature, these places untrammeled by man. And then you have to figure out, what does trammeled mean? How much trammeling have you done lately? And how exactly do you accomplish trammeling?
Right.
What does that entail?
Yeah.
It's one of those words that, I think I kind of know what that means, but really what's a trammel anyway? So it's a continuing theme of trying to, of recognizing that something is problematic, and recognizing that it's not necessarily the way I would like it to be, that some places have been fundamentally altered and become uninhabitable to many of the things that might have been there once. And in some other places, they're still heavily inhabited, but by stuff from somewhere else. I think like San Francisco Bay is the classic example of a body of water. I mean, even though it's open to the ocean, right? San Francisco Bay, most of the biota are introduced now from somewhere at some point, accidentally or on purpose. A lot of it accidentally, because a lot of it just comes in on shipping. And So there's been a massive replacement of what lived there once upon a time. But other things that affected that are how we managed the rivers that flowed into that. And I mean, it's a lots and lots of things kind of combine to produce an outcome that, when you kind of stand back and look at the history of how it happened, you kind of say, yeah, well, I can see why that happened. But it was something that would have been very hard to predict, given the knowledge that the people who were kind of undertaking the things that had these side effects could ever have imagined at the outset. So it's hard to find somebody to blame for it, really, because they were folks who were working with the knowledge that they had, trying to accomplish the goals that they had, but some other stuff happened as well.
And people have a tendency to say it's not natural just because we did it too, which is like, this is kind of the segue into the whole, what is a novel ecosystem, and like novel ecosystems, right? You know, the San Francisco Bay is a really good example. From what I've read about the San Francisco Bay, just because of how it's, you know, situated like on the Pacific Ocean and the coastline of California, it's always had a circulation and inflow of new species for a long time, and it's always been changing. And that one of the only consistents in the ecology of the Bay Area is the change, because of just like the change that the ocean brings with it constantly.
It's only fairly recently that we have had even remotely the capability of trying to do a complete inventory of any place.
Yeah.
And so quite often we have very little idea what it was like any other point. So there could, you know, other than by the evidence of, so you could find evidence of, for example, in the middens, the trash that people left 1,000 years ago, of the kind of things that they were eating. And if the kind of things that they were eating are not things that are there anymore, then you can make a case that something fundamentally had changed. But the evidence for exactly what a place like San Francisco Bay entailed once upon a time is pretty sparse. So there's a lot of inference, you know, there's a lot of best guesses. And you know, it's kind of like the fossil record. We have bits and pieces, and we can kind of say very definitely some things, and we can then from that point begin to draw inferences based on what we think we know about the way things work today. It's very complicated. But a point I want to make, though, when we're talking about wanting things to be natural and having natural versus cultural, for example, is a dichotomy. If you were to take as a premise that humans are natural, then the whole concept collapses, because it doesn't matter anymore. It doesn't matter what's natural, because everything's natural. Everything humans have done is natural. Every outcome of what humans have done is natural from that perspective. You know, we could just say that. So okay, so that doesn't help us anymore to say that it's not natural. Because if people are natural and what people do is natural. But there's a line that folks are trying to draw, trying to find, and different people have, you know, draw it different ways. There is a distinction that seems like we all kind of get it. And it's hard to really locate specifically and reliably, like there's this, at some point there's a change. But is that real? Is that important? Is it important to say natural? Is it, how can we understand this in a way that makes it actionable, that makes us say, well, we don't like the way things are turning out under the current system, so is there a way we can institute another system, or we can change the system, or something like that? So these are the is it natural? Like, is my cereal natural? Is my there's so many things that get called natural. It's almost not even helpful anymore to try and have that particular conversation, I think. I mean, we can have that conversation some more, but I find it not very productive, because once you decide people are part of nature, then everything is part of nature that people have done.
And if we look at the etymology of the word nature and natural, it means to be born, you know, that's the root meaning is just being born of, and to be born, you know, so it kind of like when you really dissect the word and look at it from that perspective, it can be kind of just like a unproductive conversation. You know, that doesn't mean that there's certain things that we do that don't have negative consequences and that do have positive consequences, but like the more I've looked into this, the more the word natural and how in nature and how our culture uses and relates to that word and concept just becomes kind of like confusing to me, you know?
Well, there are, you know, and that NAT is still the beginning of native as well. I mean, those things are all stuck together. Right. So language is just as unruly as anything else, as we try and, you know, we can't count on the fact that what somebody meant by nature once upon a time is what's still meant by nature. Yeah. There's a lot of drift, right? There's a lot of mutation. But so trying to somehow have the conversation without getting hung up on the words is never easy.
True.
But yeah, so where do we go from here? Where do you want to take this?
I would say that talking about this natural, what's not natural, et cetera. I mean, let's return just for a moment to the Midwest with all of the vast fields of corn and the vast fields of soy. And I grew up in Nebraska. I'm familiar with this landscape, and I visited it again in 2018 with different eyes, and was just, of course, astounded, you know, by the fact that you could pull up the side of it and see, you know, literally nothing except corn, soy, and then a few little groups of trees here and there where there's a homestead, you know, like out to the horizon, right? So, you know, bringing in, you know, what Gabe was talking about again, and too, and the differences, and what you said about, well, we can tell there's a difference. Well, the people who were living in that area before also, you know, were doing things to the landscape on a larger basis, and that they were using fire, for example. They were expanding prairie ecosystems and holding forest ecosystems in check, you know, for reasons of game management, of encouraging more landscape for the bison. Also, of course, all the different plants that come up in that come up in a prairie ecosystem, but which tend to be suppressed once an area becomes covered with trees, right? So we can look at that, and we can definitely see a difference between that and then the plowing under 97% of the tall grass prairie ecosystem, literally 97%, right? And then replacing it with these vast monocrops, right? Then, just to bring it all the way back to the topic of invasives here, we can now stand at the edge of this field. We can look at the weeds growing in the ditch, which, you know, originally came from, you know, Eurasia somewhere. And we can say, oh my God, look at these terrible invasive plants here. And for me, this is really what sums up the whole damn subject, the whole, you know, because it's like, what invasive plants, the people who talk about invasive plants and invasion biology, they're never counting that corn and that soy, at least that I ever hear about. That's not invasive because we want that to be there. So what's invasive is the stuff that's coming up in the fields. I mean, up in the ditches, you know. And from the viewpoint of someone who's an agriculturalist, it's also, you know, the things that are coming up that aren't your crop, you know. So so when we talk about the damage, quote, damage that's done by quote, invasive plants, part of what's counted in that is the damage which is done to crops that we've planted by weeds, some of which are actually native plants. I mean, okay, I'll just stop there.
Well, you've said the magic word, which is weed, and there, right. So a weed is a plant out of place, a plant where you don't want it to be, right? I mean, when you come down to the sort of the best fundamental description of a weed, it's a plant where you don't want it. The question of who's in charge of wanting things to be in particular places kind of is brought in there. And then, so now we're talking about who owns the land or controls it and all of that.
Wow.
But we don't, so weed and invasive didn't start out together. Those are two kind of different concepts. Weed and alien didn't start out together. Those are two different concepts. Much more recently, those have sort of fused together into the invasive weed, which could be a native plant in that particular location, or it could be an introduced plant in that particular location. So we end up getting into this strange patchwork of cross-referencing terms, and you begin to start talking like Donald Rumsfeld and known unknowns and unknown unknown, all that kind of categorization of trying to figure out, well, what do you really mean? What do you think you mean by that? But it helps the weed people, which is a whole industrial complex of anti-weediness, to attach their idea to the idea of invasive.
Yeah.
Even though the idea of invasive to an invasion biologist would be the idea of an introduced plant that is spreading rather than just behaving itself. So an invasion biologist doesn't care very much about an introduced plant that just grows where you put it. Even if you put it everywhere, like corn, it's and so if corn was spilling out of the fields, if there were anywhere left for it to to spill into, but if there were places where corn was just coming up because somehow it spread out of the places where it belonged because we said it belonged there, then corn could be considered invasive. And there are some crops in places that are can become invasive in that sense. Corn has been so bred to hang on to its seeds that it those cobs just don't shatter, the seeds just don't travel, and unless a truck dumps them somewhere, there are very few processes that could turn corn, as in Zea mays, into, and I only say that because in other places other things are called corn, but there's almost no way that corn per se could become invasive in that sense. However, it certainly has somehow convinced a whole lot of people to move it around and plant it as far as they can. And what's different about that from any other seed that's carried by any other animal somewhere in the process of its normal, natural distribution? There's all kinds of things that are carried off on fur and inside animals, and there's lots of ways that stuff gets spread. So where do we find the categorical difference? Once again, it comes down to, well, this is what we decided we wanted, and so it's okay.
It's very subjective, it seems like.
Yeah, it is. And I think that subjectivity is one of the, when we're talking about something that's supposedly scientific, and yet it turns out to be so deeply, utterly subjective. It's probably not the only thing like that, but I don't study everything else, so I don't have some good examples to sort of bring to the table of other places that we do kind of the same thing.
Right.
I think it's a important point to bring up, though, just for people who hear these terms, the culturally adopted ways that they're interpreted, which becomes a mess, as we're discussing, is to be reminded that there is value judgment going on when people from different groups are using these words. And
Yes,
it's presented as science, but there's a value judgment. And it doesn't have to be seen as a negative, but just for understanding what we're trying to look at by even bringing up the concepts.
Yes, yeah. I agree that there is a lot of, to stay metaphorical, there's a lot of baggage that's being carried around, and some of it has seeds stuck to it and they're going to fall off. Anyway, it's a really hard conversation to have and to keep control of the sort of the frame of reference, because people necessarily kind of carry around with them all kinds of ideas that they may not particularly realize they've attached here. And one of the worst things you can say to a scientist is you're being subjective and you don't realize it. You want to make friends in a hurry? That's a way to really make friends with a scientist, to say you're not being objective and you don't even realize it. So that usually doesn't end well, right?
One thing that just like with the whole big subject of like value judgments and like the emotive wartime language that is basically the language used to talk about invasive species and invasion biology, and like I was wondering, did the wartime language, like with an example is an ecological catastrophe, or like people will literally say things that like the native species are like these evil, or the invasive species are like evil, and they've declared a war on the native species, and there is like a wartime terminology used. Did that originate with Charles Elton, because he was in World War II doing like basically extermination of like rats and mice to protect the food rations and stuff? So I've been curious, like, did that kind of originate, that wartime language originate with Elton, or is it older than Elton, or did he just like make it more popular?
As far as I've been able to tell, it originated with Charles Darwin.
Darwin.
If you look at Darwin's description in The Voyage of the Beagle, so this is 1839, this was published, The Voyage, when he was on the Beagle, they took off, they left England just at the very tail end of 1831 and got back sort of the last, October or something of 1836, after going all the way around the world. But having spent the vast majority of that banging around for Southern and South America, drawing maps. So most of Darwin's experience on the Beagle Voyage was actually in Southern South America, Argentina, Chile, that whole area. He spent like 6 weeks in the Galapagos and didn't even realize necessarily what he'd gotten into until they got back with that stuff. Anyway, so Darwin, in describing an experience he had in Argentina, where he came across a vast area that seemed to be covered primarily in European thistles and wild artichokes, which is two different species, but very similar, these tall, thorny things. He used the term invasion or invaders. This was what came to mind to him. Now, having said that, I don't think invasion biology remembered that, actually, until I kind of dredged it back up. They didn't seem to realize it. But Darwin was there. He was under military escort most of the time. The Spanish Empire had just collapsed. All these people were sort of vying for control in these regions, in these new countries. So he was on a British Navy ship. He was not a member of the Navy or working for the Navy, but he was there. So this whole thing is very military in context, and so it's not unusual to imagine him coming up with a military metaphor for a place where there's all of these plants from somewhere else that are have, to all appearances, excluded whatever was there before. Why this happened, he doesn't really get into particularly, because I don't think he knew. He just happens on this situation, and here it is, and this is what he thinks of. Invasive as an idea was something already out of like arboriculture, out of tree plantations. I've found uses of the word in various places where people are talking about plants that are kind of encroaching on the plants that they're trying to grow. So invasive things kind of coming in is a word that's already out there. Charles Elton very definitely was influenced by World War II. And so but there's a thing about this, is that his book, The Ecology of Invasions by Animals and Plants, that was not his preferred title. That wasn't his idea. He wanted to call it Ecology and the Millennium. And so it was in some sort of discussion with the publishers, and I haven't seen documentation of this, so it might not have been ever written down. I sat for a month at Oxford and went through everything in Elton's papers, to see what was going on.
That's cool.
So I've had that experience of reading through everything he left, and then going to Glasgow and reading mail between his mother and his uncle to find out some more insight on the sort of the family scuttlebutt of this. But anyway, I've never seen that exact explanation of what happened, but I do know when it happened, and that is, the manuscript's done. This is Ecology in the Millennium. They said kind of, no, it's going to be something else. And what they agreed on was The Ecology of Invasions by Animals and Plants. So whose word that was, I don't know. He obviously accepted it and went with it. But if you read the book, he's not really, the word invasion doesn't show up in the book. The book was already written by the time it was titled that. It's in there like twice maybe. But he starts out talking about explosions and all kinds of there's still military metaphors, but he's not really talking about invasions per se. It wasn't what he set out to do. Yeah. But it is the title of the book. And so there's another thing where how many of the people who cite that book have actually read the book? I don't know. But I think I have unpublished something I've been working on, off and on for a long time, which is collecting reviews of that book written at the time that it came out, it came out in 1958, so through like 1964, to see how people were responding to this book. And most of these are written for scientific journals, a few for other purposes, but mostly for journals. And the parts of the book that people were really interested in when it first came out were not all the accounts of various species that were various kinds of problems in various parts of the world. It was more the sort of philosophical approach to ecology that Elton talked about in the last few chapters, which very strongly echoed what Aldo Leopold had been talking about, almost in so many words. And it's clear that either they had accidentally both come up with the same thing, or that they had kind of talked about this a little bit together. And we know they had talked together, so I'm going with that story. But but it's like a decade after Leopold died. Leopold had already sort of said this, but then Elton says it in very similar language another way. Anyway, he with the whole invasions thing, that just wasn't his intention, and the folks who were reacting to him were saying we were really intrigued by this sort of philosophical approach to conservation that he has. In 2000, when the new edition, which is just a reprint, the University of Chicago Press puts out a reprint in 2000, and Daniel Simberloff, student of Edward O. Wilson's, gets to write the foreword. He says, don't pay any attention to this part at the end. In effect, what you need to be thinking about is all these cases, right? We're not going to go with Elton's ideas about how what all this means. We're just going to say, look what a great job he did of telling us how terrible it all was. So it really depends on who gets put in charge of interpretation and revisionism and publication generally.
So what was, briefly, what was that approach that he was talking about then at the end?
Elton was basically convinced that these phenomena were inevitable. They were going to be problematic in some cases, but it was inevitable that with the way we were living, the things we were doing, that this was just an outcome that you had to expect. he said we have this sort of three. I was trying to remember this as well as I can. He's had kind of a what I think I call it sort of a tripod of values that he and Leopold shared. One of them, Leopold called religious, but Elton called ethical. They both talked about aesthetics, and they both talked about practicalities. So there are these aesthetic values that we bring to life and how we want to live and how we want the world to be. And there are sort of religious or ethical principles that we like to be in force. And then there's this sort of practicality, which Elton says sort of looms over everything else. And you can find this, you know, again, you'll find this, you go back and look at Leopold as well. They both kind of settled on this way of looking at the world. So Elton was saying, yeah, you know, some of this is really problematic, and some of these cases are just startlingly unfortunate. On the other hand, he said, this is what we do, kind of, that he just didn't say, he did not launch invasion biology. He did not say from now on we need to have this whole new effort in science and do this. This was a side project for him. This was something that was just sort of eating at him, and he finally kind of did this book. It wasn't his biggest project. It wasn't what he personally felt was his most important one. And that pattern actually follows throughout the history of people talking about introduced species. By and large, they picked it up as a side project. It was something they kind of noticed in the course of whatever else they were doing, and it kind of reached some sort of critical mass for them, and then they would write a paper about it, and then they would put it down, and they would go on and do something else again. So that was sort of the pattern until the teenies, when some folks got together and said, this was actually a specific meeting in Africa about Mediterranean ecosystems, and Mediterranean ecosystems don't just exist around the Mediterranean. You know, Southern California's got a Mediterranean ecosystem, parts of Australia, et cetera. A whole new topic, a whole new set of classifications and choices. But you know, they're talking and they say, oh, well, we've got these things happening. And the other people say, oh, yeah, I've got that same thing happening here. And this was sort of that moment that gets credited with being sort of the birthplace of sort of modern invasion biology. But a whole lot of things had to change in conservation thinking and environmentalism. A whole bunch of stuff had to happen post-Elton. So there's this long incubation, and these guys kind of looked back at Elton and said, oh yeah, so here's our inspiration. And fortunately, Elton had been very good at sort of keeping a low profile generally, so he wasn't strongly known anywhere else for much that they had to overcome. They just kind of adopted him in retrospect and said, this is our guy.
Right, and so, go ahead.
I just wanted to say real quick, I mean, it's just more like a snippet, like, because Daniel Simberloff seems to be like one of the big heads in like the invasion, like, and that informs a lot of like invasion biology. And I've seen like some of his writings where he explicitly states that like non-native plants just shouldn't be there, and that they're like all kind of bad if they're not native, you know, not really just like if they're invasive that they're not good, but just like the fact that they're non-native. You know, and I've definitely noticed that about like Simberloff, that he takes that stance, and he was part of like the creation of like the National Invasive Species Council during the Clinton era, when he was part of the group that wrote the letter to like the administration about, and used the language of like, there's an ecological catastrophe looming for us. And so that, yeah, that's one thing I've noticed about Simberloff.
I don't want to put words in Dan's mouth or oversimplify what he says, because he is not that categorical. I have my students read his book And I will disappear from view briefly. So Simberloff has kind of taken the mantle of leadership for invasion biology, for better or worse. And he can write books called Invasive Species, What Everyone Needs to Know, and seriously believe that what he's telling them is, everyone needs to know this, and apparently this is all they need to know. And he makes the case, but he does not make a simplistic case. As my students will attest, to their chagrin, he is very wordy and very detailed, and he tries to make the case that this is all much more nuanced, but he doesn't really give up any ground in that process. He never really allows that this can be good. There's either the things that don't matter or there's the things that are problems. None of this is commendable in any sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I've noticed that.
So did you want to say something?
Yeah. It was just occurring to me as I'm listening to you all talking and bringing up stuff that it seems like there's this process of cultural usage of some of these concepts becoming more fragmented or used as sound bites. Like the part where I focus my attentions or concerns a lot is the application of going after invasives, especially like on the big river systems of the West, where then everywhere you see one of these so-called invasive plants, you want to eradicate it, irrelevant of the landscape changes that have happened. So I don't know, it was just a funny thought I was starting to formulate, that it's like a fragmented cultural mental landscape that's taking these pieces and running, that is unable to leave room for the nuance when it has that hold.
Yes, and this takes us back to this idea of that root metaphor, or the constitutive metaphor. There is no case in which you can say, unless you're organizing it, there's no case in which telling someone there's an invasion going on immediately makes them say, oh, good, I'm sure glad there's an invasion going on. Now, it's once again, we can't be completely categorical about it, because if you said this to a bunch of people in May of 1944 and you were in England, and we're saying we're about to invade the continent again. Oh, good, finally we're going to go and take the fight to the Germans. So that's an example of an invasion that from one point of view was welcome news. From the point of view, however, from the point of view of the people that the invasion was coming at, right? When the invasion is coming at your face, then an invasion is typically not a good thing. Mm-hmm. You can't get away from that. So as soon as we use the word invasion, we're talking about something that has that connotation. And when we extend it to saying not only are these things invading, they're undertaking an invasion, but they are constitutionally, characteristically invasive, that this is what they do. To go back to, say, the Terminator. It's what they do. It's all they do, right? These are bad actors. These are problems. These are out to get us. There's no good thing about what we're talking about here.
Mm-hmm.
This is the part that really sticks in the popular mind when they hear the term invasive. And, I'm a member of, I'm on the Facebook group for the California Native Plant Society. And I'm on there because it's awesome for plant ID. I'm out taking a hike. I see a flower. What is it? I post a picture, 5 minutes tops usually, because there's, 12,000 people in the group or whatever, and someone identifies it. That's great, Yeah. But then there's constantly this talk about, invasives there. The term is used in all sorts of different ways, as in, it's something that spreads enthusiastically or et cetera. But everyone seems to and so they talk about native plants as being, quote, invasive as well. I mean, but behind all of it, there's sort of this assumption that, oh, there's a scientific concept backing this up, that the designation of invasive, that's as an intrinsic characteristic of this plant, that's scientifically backed up. I might not know that science myself, but I'm sure it's there. That's sort of, people assume that there's something that's backing that up. So when you talk about Elton, talking about his concerns were the ethical, the aesthetic, and the practical, but not, per se the scientific. I mean, I feel like it goes back a ways, and I feel like this is what's important, in that consequences come out of people assuming that this is a scientific concept. And these consequences include spraying poisons everywhere. They include, all sorts of removal projects, that are massive, that aren't really, that often aren't thought through, very clearly, and so I feel like that's just maybe kind of a point that we need to make at this point as well, is just to stress that it's not really a scientific word.
I would really like to know, honestly, what people are thinking, because I don't always know why people are thinking what they're thinking, and how these particular terms appeal to them in various circumstances. There is so much kind of rolled into this. I think a lot of people who become advocates for native anythings are generally, and I'll be general here, are seeing them as underdogs. They're seeing them as put upon. They're seeing them as having been ill-used, and they need an advocate. There are other people, but native plant gardening, when it first got started, wasn't so much about conservative kind of, having a sort of rarefied identity as someone who's into this particular kind of thing and not some other. It was just like being into some particular kind of rose, or being into some particular kind of other plant. So there are lots of versions of this, and I think you have to really think of any of these sort of social movement kind of things very much as coalitions rather than as monoliths. They have
Right.
certain kinds of interests and values in common. Any two of them, you get them together, and you get them talking long enough, and they're gonna find something to argue about. But right, so like any coalition, but there are these aspects of it that seem really overridingly important, and they get together on. Not everyone who's involved in these is going to be very happy about, for example, the extensive use of chemical pesticides, right? This whole new embrace in environmentalism, embrace of among environmentalists of chemical suppression of alien plants. That was a coup for the biocides industry. Being able to make that connection that would have been unthinkable at some point, I think just post Silent Spring, to say, what we really need, Ms. Carson, is to go deploy all of our various chemical weapons on all of these introduced plants. I think that would have been sort of antithetical to the mood that it was produced by Silent Spring. So the fact that they've been able to make that move, and it would be fascinating to actually document the process, if you could, by which it became acceptable to people who are primarily interested in nature conservation and trying to keep natives native and all that stuff, but have then accepted this idea that we should be attacking everything else with the stuff that was causing a lot of the problems in the first place. It's it's amazing. It is really an amazing kind of thing that I haven't had there's only so much of me to go around and try and follow some of these stories, but that one, how did that happen? What were the turning points? Where was the moment when somebody from some mainstream environmentalist organization said, hey, that sounds like a good idea? Because why? Because some corporation was suddenly going to support them. I mean, it's it's messy. It's messy stuff.
Yeah.
This is the subject I circle around a lot in the research work I've been doing. And it's really incredible how much all of the land management protocols tout herbicides as the most environmentally friendly thing to do at this point in time. Like, it's really actually hard to find other examples to try to collate different processes that might help you get certain results to support certain species in different habitats that don't involve selective use of herbicides as the #1 tool above all others. It's really incredible and frightening to me, actually. So, yeah.
I can only add that when I was working with a lot of people who were particularly interested in natural areas, and the whole idea of what's a natural area and what's not natural and what's even an area. I mean, you can actually get heavily involved in this. But I can remember going to, so vegetation management was part of this problem, and I can remember going to a vegetation management meeting, and there are door prizes, and the door prizes are gallons of herbicide. This is by the sort of the late, probably 1997, 98, something like that. This was already, the move is already afoot, that the people who are going to be managing for natural conditions, this is your tool, and we're going to just give it to you, so have some fun.
Wow.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have guessed that it had gone back to then. I would have pinned it at the Invasive Species Council that Gabe referred to before, that came about during the Clinton era, because I've looked into that a little bit, and Monsanto and DuPont were among the players who were involved in the formation of that council. They helped write the original documents, and when they're talking about invasive species there, they say that they're concerned about the economic and the environmental impacts of them, and they're putting economic first, and so it's another one of these cases where people have come to see the designation of invasive species and the eradication of them as being primarily an environmental or a conservation concept, but in fact it was never that to begin with. There were always other considerations that were in play. Many of them agricultural. Obviously.
Well, you know what they say: follow the money.
Right.
And it goes back to what Leopold and Elton both realized, that this practical, and I'm resisting air quotes, this idea of practicality looms over everything else when people are deciding. I mean, there is just this thing that has to happen, for the sake of continuities of various kinds, which may be commendable continuities or they may not, depending on your point of view, but a different sort of sustainability, maybe.
Yeah. Another interesting thing that I really love your paper, the Invasion of the Second Greatest Threat. It's very well written and it's fun to read. You talk about the origin a little bit of biodiversity as a concept and as a language, and how, I don't think you quite worded it this way, but you alluded to it in like it becoming this like moral value for people to jump on the high horse of, in advocation of biodiversity, but how the concept of biodiversity is kind of tricky and you even put a quote from the guy who coined the term in the paper, saying like when he coined the term, he said it like biodiversity is taking the logical out of biological, end quote. I think I quoted that right. But could you speak to the complicated concept and almost like the elusive substance of biodiversity, and how it's kind of like a slippery slope once you start doing research into the cultural, political dynamics around it? You know, like I'm still struggling to understand it myself, which has been why I've been excited to like ask you about it, because I feel like I get a lot of conflicting answers and bigger questions when I research this.
Right. I've written a lot of stuff, and unfortunately, I don't have it all loaded into RAM at the moment, so I can't remember every bit of it. If you want to pull up the paper and figure out the guy's name who did this.
Walter Rosen.
Yes.
Okay, well, Rosen, right, Walter Rosen. Good, excellent. So the back around 1984, 1985, Rosen, E.O. Wilson, some other people were trying to come up with an organizing principle, a theme, something for a conference that they wanted to put on. And it was an advocacy event. It was not a science event. It was an advocacy event. Okay, so that was understood to be the purpose of all of this thing. And so among the things that got tossed out was this contraction, biodiversity. And as you say, Walter Rosen quipped at some point, you know, it's taking the logical out of biological diversity. Taking the logical out, because the point was not to produce a scientific concept, but to produce something that could be advocated for, a sort of a value proposition that wasn't even quantifiable. I mean, if it were scientific, we could quantify it, but it wasn't about quantity. This was a quality. So biodiversity becomes the title of a book, and then later of another book. But it was always a thing to be desired, right? That biodiversity, and this idea that sort of the more the better, the more diverse, the better, the more different places, and is included a lot of things. Remember, the scale of thinking about biodiversity is everything. They'll say it's everything from the genetic to the planetary. What are we talking about? It's very kind of unclear, because it can be anything. Apparently it can't be nothing, but it can be anything. But it sounds so good. It's life, and it's diverse, and like that's one of the, it's got, you know, it's catchy that way. And why not like that? And I can remember in 1986 having that book in my hand, and being, you know, we were excited college students and thinking about like, what does this mean for all this conservation stuff we're running and doing? This is when I was trying to become a park naturalist type. Yeah, so the funny thing that happened is that biodiversity managed to migrate or be migrated from this very qualitative conservation imperative, this thing to be advocated for, into the scientific literature, where it started being treated as a quantity.
I remember a formula in school for it.
Yeah,
measuring it.
And there is alpha diversity, and there's beta diversity, and there's gamma diversity, and there are different ways of comparing different things, right? And those, they don't always say biodiversity, but it was like there was alpha diversity before there was biodiversity. So diversity was a thing, but these concepts kind of got merged in the conservation biology literature. And they stuck together like that, to the point that biodiversity is now kind of naturally seen as a scientific concept. when it isn't. And it wasn't to begin with. It's gotten kind of glommed onto this other idea. I mean, diversity, we can calculate diversities. There is an actual quantifiable sciencey thing that you can do there. And alpha, beta, gamma diversities are all different things that you can compare different ways. And they can tell you something about the world. But this biodiversity thing is a much different, vaguer, uncontained concept.
Wow.
And it's, you know, so then from there to saying that something is a threat to biodiversity. Okay, so if diversity is a number, if diversity is a quantity, what's a threat to a quantity? Is it a threat to turn one number into another number? I'm threatening you 11, I'm going to turn you into 10. What am I doing? What am I thinking? So biodiversity is, you can have a threat to something you're advocating for, but it's hard to have a threat to something you're counting unless you stipulate in advance that more is better and fewer is worse, or vice versa, or that there's some range in which is the good and fewer or more is bad. I mean, there's all kinds of things that you have to account for here that we typically just kind of gloss over in this discussion.
Yeah, like I remember reading about how plants considered invasive are not included in the biodiversity indices, like when they're often not. So in that way, it makes more sense understanding it as an advocacy idea rather than a scientific thing. That would make more sense that you wouldn't include those because you don't want to look at them. But taken as a scientific measurement, it kind of doesn't make sense if that you wouldn't be including them.
And it's gotten, so it's gotten to the point where, if I recall right, in the current edition of the Jepson manual, they just don't include invasive species. They don't include, I mean, they're just not there. As if they weren't there on the ground. So the Jepson manual is the California flora, in effect. The list of the official list of plants, the most official list you can have of plants in California, doesn't include things that they just don't want to be in California, even if they're there. And it doesn't include things like citrus. Mm-hmm. You can't find an orange tree in the Jepson manual, even if you can find an orange tree in California. If I'm remembering correctly. And sometimes I'm wrong, and but check it out.
Okay.
So if these things are not part of some index of biodiversity or some totaling or some summation of it, especially if they're extremely common and they are in effect what we would otherwise consider some sort of a keystone species for that whole system, which does happen, there's no explanation for that system otherwise. What are we talking about? Is it just, we're just writing off that whole thing, even though there are birds living in it and lizards and rodents and all kinds of other stuff? Do we just say, yeah, well, that's all just wrong and we can ignore it, or we should scrape that off and try something else?
This is a really important topic too. I mean, I'm sure you heard recently about the low reported numbers in monarch butterflies this year.
Yeah.
How it was tremendously low. And I was starting to look into this topic a little bit. And one thing that I found was that many of the favorite roosting sites of the monarch butterflies along the coast are eucalyptus trees. And there's a reason for this, is because eucalyptus trees are tall. And so shorter trees along the coast would not actually be good. They wouldn't serve as good roosting points, because it's the taller trees is somehow getting them out of the wind more, or I can't remember exactly what the reason was, but there was something about how taller trees were suitable or far more suitable for roosting sites than shorter trees. And there actually aren't taller trees that are native to the California coast in these areas. And so it was really interesting, because it was like, okay, one reason to, quote, save native trees and native plants and to keep on invasives is because that's what the native fauna, want. And yet in this case, we can see that, well, now wait a minute. the monarchs are actually depending on this, I guess that in the literature, if you look back, it's not until after eucalyptus trees were introduced to California and became widespread that these large roostings were even mentioned, actually. I mean, this was, I mean, I just started to get into all this and was really fascinated by it, because I'm like, oh, so were they not roosting in these large numbers until those trees appeared here? And then of course it's also true that, something like, a third of California butterflies at this point, have come to depend on non-native plants, in part because, look at the Central Valley, how many native plants are left there, among the almond groves and the olive groves and the rice fields. I mean, like there's nowhere else, obviously they've come to depend on it. So I don't know, that's just,
to go Hollywood on this, think back to Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come.
Right.
Yeah.
If you create habitat and things happen upon it, they are going to occupy it if it's suitable for them.
Right.
Who could be upset about monarch butterflies in California? Well, if the only reason the monarch butterflies are in California is because we created something that suited them, is it still good? I mean, nobody moved them there, so are they invaders, or are they what? I mean, where are they supposed to be? We always have this problem of where are they supposed to be? And so, I mean, I'm happy to report that I had monarch butterfly caterpillars out here in my front yard in Phoenix on some nice introduced tropical milkweeds.
Right.
And got to watch them do their whole thing. But they would never have been in this particular spot were it not for a massive federal irrigation project built in, around 1900. There's not a possibility in the world that there would ever be monarch butterflies here. So it just gets pretty complicated. There are so many species that have whose ranges have changed as a result of the various things we have done to change land cover in all kinds of places. The world is just, you can't unwind this and get it back to, once upon a time. Even people who are into rewilding are often talking about bringing in predators, or, that wouldn't have been here otherwise, bringing in something in order to kind of create a megafauna that is long since gone and long since superseded by other things.
Yeah.
And those things are going to be superseded by other things eventually too. It's the more you think, the more you know about it, the more you think about it, sort of the more mind-boggling it gets. It doesn't get more organized and sensible as you look into it. It gets harder and harder to kind of all reconcile rather than easier.
Yeah. I mean, in short, the possibly beneficial, well, the demonstrated, beneficial effects, for some creatures in an environment from other species coming in that weren't native there are just, we see this, I mean, I'm in southeastern or southwestern New Mexico, and I planted a bunch of dill in my garden this year this last summer for pickles, and some black swallowtail caterpillars came because they love it,
Yep.
And I'm not sure what else they would have been eating around there, actually. I mean, they love that plant, they love the umbels. And if it wasn't for me doing that, I mean, I don't know, anyway, to the black swallowtail butterfly and to the caterpillars, this was great that this plant was here.
Yeah. And this is a theme I've sort of run into a lot, that I can go out to if we've had a good wet winter, then I can go out here in the spring to some vacant lot down along Interstate 10 and see a vast field of common mallow, malva,
Mhm.
You know, it's one of the most ubiquitous weeds in the world of agriculture. And so it's going to be big and tall. This stuff is growing up. It's 3 feet tall. And all over it, there are painted lady butterfly caterpillars. They're taking advantage of it because it's what they do. I mean, this is exactly what the painted ladies needed. Painted ladies, by the way, that's the most common butterfly worldwide. It's everywhere. And there's some amazing research that's been done on how these populations work in various places. But, you know, the cascade of things that had to happen in order to make this particular spot a haven for these particular butterflies at this particular time is truly historic in scope. It's vast. And yet what we have are these animals living in suitable habitat, doing their thing that they do. This is just, they don't know any of this stuff. They don't have the capacity to care about it, as far as I know. They have no idea that there is anywhere else, that maybe they have no idea that there is a here. You know, this is what we sort of bring to it and dump on all of these things is pretty massive. You know, so there are some differences between people and these other things, but a lot of that is a kind of knowledge that just isn't accessible to them at all.
Totally.
Yeah, like I think about the argument for what do they call it? Well, there's inferior forage, so that's one argument for taking out food that somebody's living on because it's not the best food for them. And then this idea that if you have a garden that they come to, but there's not more of it around, it's a trap.
Yeah.
And
yeah. Well, sure. I mean, it is reasonable to say that we can talk about ecology and population dynamics in terms of sources and sinks. There's really high quality habitat for some organism in which those things are reproducing like mad, but it's not big enough to contain them all. So they're going to have to spread out and look for more habitat. And if the rest of the habitat in the vicinity that's accessible to them is not good enough to sustain that same sort of reproductive effort, things are going to be spreading from the high quality into the low quality and dying and not reproducing. And so they're thus the source and the sinks. Okay. And that is an actual phenomenon. It's been documented. You can see it happening. It is also a dynamic one. It's not necessarily permanent that this area is going to be the source and this one is going to be the sink. I mean, because stuff is changing.
Yeah.
But we can make a certain set of assertions that this is kind of the way the world works, that things are patchy, and because they're patchy, some places are better for some things and some places are better for other things. And you know, then you get into all the dynamics of predator and prey. If there's a whole lot of some organism being produced here, then it becomes a resource and it's going to be found. And then maybe it's all going to get eaten up, and then the predator thing is, they're going to crash. Their population has nothing to support them anymore. So they either go somewhere else and try to find something else, or they just begin to die off. And this is one of the things we see as being apparently kind of normal, the way things work. It's ugly because it goes against the sort of very old static balance of nature idea. And it actually takes us back to Charles Elton, because he was one of the people who sort of began to figure out that there was this kind of ongoing dynamic, and this massive boom and bust thing was just kind of the way it seemed like the world worked, at least as far as they could see at the time. And it's still sort of a classic illustration. One of the things Elton is actually remembered for is his work taking data from, of all places, the Hudson's Bay Company, Hudson's department stores today, or at least recently. I don't know if they still exist the way things are going, but because they had people out trapping, bringing in furs, the furs they were going to use to make stuff, to make hats, to make coats, whatever. And it turned out that that there was over time an interesting dynamic in the number of furs that were actually available from say Canada. And so he began to use their actual data for what was coming into them from the trappers as a proxy for like how many animals are really out there. So there's a presumption, but it's going up and down. And then he found that sort of there were the predator numbers tended to go up and down following the way that the prey numbers did. So if we're talking about Arctic hare or something like that, the numbers of Arctic hare and the number of Arctic foxes were coupled, the number of lynx were coupled into this, and they kind of followed each other in this weird sort of laggy pattern. And they didn't get it totally regularized or anything, but they were able to see that it wasn't just that there was this vast array of things living out there kind of in consistent numbers the whole time, but stuff actually changed quite a bit. And that, things like that just destabilize the way people think and require you to have new ideas.
Right, because on a historical note, Frederic Clements seemed to be like the father of the climax, static, stable, biotic community, right? And that's, long since been like shown to be not true, but it still seems to be a very common sentiment, and like just people are attached to that worldview, and which makes change. It's like this whole conversation of like, what biological invasions do harm, but is it really harm or is it change? And like, what is change in ecology? Change is the only constant. If you look at like, on a geologic time scale, especially, change is evolution, right? So this kind of like brings us into this novel ecosystems conversation, which is like a really important, inseparable aspect of this whole conversation is novel ecosystems. And like, what does that mean? It means change. And like what, and how can we, make this term more, I guess, popular or understandable and understanded to people and like relatable to people. Because I've heard different people say like, oh, fuck the whole novel ecosystems thing. But I've also heard people be like other scientists, in places like Hawaii that are like, well, Hawaii is more diverse, biologically diverse species count wise than it's actually ever been because of all of these new and invasive, or just like these it's a novel ecosystem that's more diverse than it's ever been, so and Matt, you do teach a novel ecosystems course at university, and so could you tell us about this? And Professor Matt.
Well, novel ecosystems is not an idea that I came up with, but it's an idea that Richard Hobbs and some other people came up with. Some of the folks who were involved, some of the many folks who were involved in writing a paper called "Don't Judge Species on Their Origins." It was published in Nature. I think 2011 is when we all got together and did this, and it's a kind of a capsule summary of an approach. But so novel ecosystems, I think the fundamentally important thing about the idea of novel ecosystems is just the recognition that ecosystems are open and they change over time. And some of those changes result from what people are doing. That does not make them non-ecosystems. all the things that go into ecology, everybody eating each other and pollinating each other and all this stuff that's going on is still going on in these places. It may have a somewhat different cast of characters. It may be continuing to change in ways that we can't necessarily predict very easily, but it's still happening. And so we can still treat them as ecosystems. there was a time when ecologists really shied away from studying anything that appeared to have substantial human effects, because that wasn't real ecology.
Right.
And to go back to Frederick Clemens and some of the other early ecologists, I mean, they actually just said this wasn't even worth studying because it wasn't interesting. Now, Clemens wasn't totally stupid or anything. His ideas actually were true-ish in the places that he studied ecology. This change of a community through, and Clemens made up lots of words and lots of units and lots of things that might not have actually sort of existed, but he was creating a whole. There's no way to have that conversation because there were no words for it. So we always have to make up words for it, whether we use metaphors or whether we use something else, or we make up something that was nonsense, a complete neologism, just, pick some letters and string them together, whatever you're going to do. But the development, he could in Nebraska watch a pond, if it sat there long enough, gradually fill up with organic material, turn into a meadow, gradually, shrubs come in, trees come in, and then, it sits around like that until something knocks it down. That wasn't a totally wrong idea, but it was not right in a lot of other places besides where he was.
Right.
And so this, early on, I mentioned that the sort of tendency to overgeneralize is a problem that we have in ecology.
Yeah. Anyway,
so what were we trying to get at here? There was, my train of thought has derailed. So what was the question that we were trying to get at?
Well, yeah, we're just, talking about novel ecosystems and change.
Oh, right. All right. Sorry. Yeah. So what I do in the class is I take my students to places that have very definite histories, human histories. There's something has happened here that has either strongly influenced or completely determined the ecology of the area, what was going to develop afterwards. And in some cases, they are places where people tried to create or recreate or emulate something that had come before, or some of them are places that were just simply completely ignored. They were generated, there was accidentally, as a result of that, some characteristics of these places that life could thrive. And so we just go there, and I encourage them before we go to do as much research as they can online, because there are clues, there are definitely clues to all of these places. You can find out something, and I give them some of the clues and I make them find the others. But, I encourage them to do this research ahead of time to find out why, okay, so Dr. Chu is taking us to this place. He's making us go there. Why? What's the deal here? And they should come kind of with a hypothesis about what they're expecting. And so the ones that do this, I'm invariably successful in convincing students to do homework, because teachers always are. But the conversation with the ones who have done this work ahead of time is really fun, to just watch the wheels turning and hear them grinding and trying to figure out, okay, so yeah, there's stuff living here. In some cases, despite everybody's best efforts to keep anything from living here. How is this working? What is this telling us? Some of the places I take them are literally restoration, right? Ecological restoration projects. And some of the places I take them to vacant lots. I take them to a soccer field. I take them to lots of different places where we sort of try to interrogate the landscape a bit. and find ways of applying sort of conservation biology principles or priorities, or what's the thing. The theme of the whole course is in trying to let people wrestle with the idea of introduced species and whether they're a problem. I mean, that there's definitely, that's the key issue. And so, I mean, it's inevitably obvious by the time we're done what I think, but I make them read Simberloff's book. I make them read Ken Thompson's book. This one's a lot of fun. Where Do Camels Belong?
Oh.
Yeah, so they have to read those two books together, the Simberloff and the Thompson book, and then make some decisions. They have to write me a book review, as if they're writing for someone who's never read either one, and they have to explain what these guys are saying, and they have to tell me what they think about it. I mean, where have you landed as a result of reading these two books? And taking this course and going out on the ground and actually seeing examples of this kind of thing happening. What does it mean? Now, you've heard all the sort of rhetoric that's come at you one way or another through your schooling, through the media, through any place that you find it. But now you've wrestled through this. What do you think? Mm-hmm. What's happening here, and what's important and what isn't? So that's, in addition to that, then they're learning a lot of just local natural history. So a lot of my students have decided to become conservation biologists in college and weren't necessarily raised outdoors learning plants and animals. If they were raised outdoors, this is not what they were paying attention to. So there's a lot of catching up to do. On the other hand, some of them have already interned with agencies and worked in the herbarium and other things. So it's really a broad range of people and experiences that come to this. And it makes the conversations more interesting, really. It's fun to watch some people discover this stuff and other people to like, oh, yeah, I knew this, but I know it a different way now. So that's kind of what the course is about. And it's meant to fill a field methods requirement for conservation biology and ecology students at ASU.
Do you ever take audits in your class? Or sit-ins?
Yeah, well, I can't say yes here, can I? But if you get a group together somewhere and we want to do this outside the auspices of ASU, then we can talk. But it's that apparently is going to become my next career if this gets out.
Yeah.
So basically, you'll go to a site and you're doing a survey.
Of sorts. I mean, it's hard to do a survey if they don't know the names of anything yet.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So over a period of time, they see many of the same things over and over again, become familiar with them. At that point, we can begin talking about sort of doing real quantification kind of stuff. And strangely enough, the place I take them to start thinking about quantifying vegetation is the soccer field. But because it's the simplest possible situation. It's much more complicated than you think because these soccer fields aren't that well maintained. But so there's stuff there that the Parks Department doesn't really have in mind. But yeah, it's a challenge. If I were doing it with grad students who had come in with some background already in field work, it would be we could do it a very different way. But that's not who I'm teaching. I'm teaching people who come from a variety of walks of life, most of whom think conservation biology is a good idea and have learned some things about it in classes, but don't have a lot of practical experience.
Yeah.
Right. And you said that, by the end of the course, they're clear kind of what you think or where you stand, about things.
I don't make them read my papers,
Right.
but in a sort of Socratic way, by the kind of questions that I ask them about
Right.
what they've been reading, about what they've been seeing, and the things I draw their attention to, and all of that, I think they realize they're in the presence of I don't know which word to use. My favorite
Skeptic.
my favorite has to remain the time that an author in Scientific American called me the gadfly of invasion biology.
Oh, that is a good one.
So maybe we should, in keeping with my identity as a bird watcher gone horribly wrong, maybe that's another good weird one that we can throw in there. Am I skeptical of invasion biology? I think I don't even see a way for those two words to go together meaningfully. So, I mean, if it comes down to philosophically declaring that to be a category mistake, it's hard to find much redeeming value in it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
How do you know if a lot of your students end up going and browsing through your material that you've written over the years?
Well, they know it exists, but they don't have time. I mean, they're already reading 3 books and trying to take other classes and stuff. So some do. I mean, people have shown up in my classroom having read some things like The Invasion of the Second Greatest Threat, which is only half the title. It's such a long title. Ecologists, environmentalists, experts in the invasion of the second greatest threat, which, by the way, is freely available online by the publisher.
Yeah. And by the way, I'm going to put your links to these articles in the show notes.
Okay.
Another one, what is it called? The Rise of Biotic Nativeness, but the history of the English.
The rise and fall of biotic nativeness.
Yeah. I'm definitely
a historical perspective. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's one where we talk about this, a bunch of stuff. So, but yeah.
That's a good one. I like that one.
Okay.
So you.
I do too.
Yeah.
So you said you wouldn't put those words together, invasion and biology, like that.
I certainly wouldn't put together invasive species.
Right.
I don't see any way for species as I understand them, and species is another fraught concept, but I don't see any way for that which biology describes as species, the way we define the biological species concept. I don't see any way for those things to invade, much less to be characteristically invasive. I just don't think that the two concepts are, have any way to meet.
Right.
And again, invasion biology, since I don't see any way for species to actually engage in an invasion, it would be hard for me to study them in the process of, from the perspective of that being the process that they're undergoing.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because that's kind of the place I've been coming around to as I study these things, is where I've come to this point of like, well, wait a minute. It strikes me that the term invasive species is, well, it's kind of a nonsense term. That's kind of that's how I've put it in my own head.
That is what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we're saying the same thing. I'm just being more academic about it.
Yeah. No, and I appreciate that. But so because I mean, really, at most, one could describe the particular behavior, the behavior of a species in a particular time and place as invasive, if they feel like using a qualitative term like that. I mean, that's like maybe the most that could be given to that term, is that in a particular context, one could say, I'm just looking for like, what's the most that could be given to the word here,
Well, and I think that is the most, and I don't think the word is necessary, because if we're talking about a population of something that is increasing in numbers, and as a result of its increase in numbers is necessarily sort of occupying more space on the landscape, well, that's really sciencey. Are they in some way competing with other species for something, for resource, for for space itself. Just there's no organism that takes up space that is not denying that space to something else. It's not just something people do. It's not just something that our stuff does. It's any tree on the landscape can be the only tree there. Then I'm trying to think of where to go from that point. I don't know. Ask something else that prompts me to continue.
One thing that I hear a lot of people say when I'm having these discussions is how they insist that invasive species halt. I've literally heard people say that they permanently halt succession and create ecological wastelands. And to me, that really doesn't make any sense. Like growing up I grew up in the Southwest, and I've watched, I've walked I had to walk a driveway my whole life, like a half-mile driveway, getting dropped off by the bus and walking home. And I've for 13 years I did this, and I watched basically how grazing changed the landscape and how it changes, just in the 13 years is a really small period of time, but a lot can happen in 13 years. I've seen thickets of thistle, whole field taken over by thistle, disappear, and all the thistle gone after 5 years, and it did its thing there for a while, and then it just moved on, and I think that the assertion that people say that of ecological wastelands and that succession can be permanently halted in the first place, that just doesn't make sense to me, and I don't think it's true.
I don't think it's true either. And however we want to talk about succession is whether it's, Clemens talked about a very deterministic kind of process, and there are other ideas that are much less deterministic. There is just this dynamic that occurs with climate, with weather, with a variety of inputs. It's the complexity is really significantly huge. Not absolutely anything can happen, but a whole lot of things can happen over time. Honestly, if you spent 13 years walking the same driveway looking at a system, you've spent more time than most ecologists get to spend doing that.
Yeah.
We do routinely, one thing that's been very typical since its inception is this idea of the space for time substitution, which is we can look at a whole bunch of different conditions on landscape, and we can then imagine a series of events that would produce the change from this one to this one, with any number in between, depending on what's available. And that's really what they were doing with the first ideas of succession. Well, I can see here's a pond. Okay, that's a pond. That's good. Now over here's a pond that's kind of got some plants starting to grow up in it and fill it up. And you go, oh yeah, well that's going to be a change. And I can go and see an old pond, and this one is now kind of filled up and turning into more of a meadow. And I can find another one. And so, all right, so it's perfectly sensible to say that this represents a sequence of events. But I have not seen the sequence of events. I have seen a series of places, and I have interpreted it that way. So is that wrong? It can be really wrong, or it can be really right, but you can't really be totally sure without a whole lot more work and observation. And in the end, each one of these ponds is probably going to go through a little bit different process. Some of them are always going to stay ponds for a very long time, and some of them are going to fill up in a big hurry for a variety of reasons. The idea that these dynamics are going to stop is sort of antithetical to anything we could possibly say about the real world. How can you make something stop? Even putting cattle on the landscape did not stop succession. However, it has always been kind of a tenet of range ecology, of range management, to say that there is a particular point in succession that is ideal for raising cattle.
Yeah.
You're going to get the most bang for the buck. You're going to get the most pounds of cow off an acre of land under a particular set of conditions that include certain plants, etc. So range management, and I actually got a degree in range management at one point. So I've heard this out of the mouths of range management professors. You are trying to get your landscape to this sort of sweet spot where you're not overgrazing, but you're not undergrazing, and the shrubs are not sort of taking over. There's the air quotes, taking over. They're not taking over anyway. They're shrubs. The shrubs don't take over. They just grow there. It's not just me. Anyway,
I know how it is.
Anyway, so this idea that you can sort of manipulate the landscape with your domestic animals,
Yeah.
to the point of your sort of optimum benefit, and the optimum benefit being maximum productivity.
Yeah.
Productivity, right? What can be bad about productivity? Things ought to be maximally productive. They ought to be maximally efficient. They ought to, there's all these things that we bring into our discussion of how the world ought to work, that really, don't necessarily all apply quite the way we want them to apply. I don't think that word means what you think it means.
Yeah. To kind of like bring it back around to the like novel ecosystems discussion too. Yeah. So like what makes it novel, right? Is like why is this such an important, we've already gone through such a big historical talk, and novel ecosystems are presently happening, but into the future, we're really going to start seeing novel ecosystems more and more. How is this, what makes it novel, and why is this an important thing to be talking about and understanding?
Well, as Richard Hobbs et al. Originally put it, it was just novel because people influenced the way it's working in some substantial way. And again, the places that I choose to take my students are places that have these recountable histories that we can say this is sort of the series of events that we know happened here. But on into the future, I think a lot of people, it's not just me, that there's quite a common sense these days that the world doesn't sort of get a redo. Trying to force some pre-existing condition on any places is not only a bad idea, it is a totally impractical idea. Life is going on around us. Things are moving and getting moved, and they're adapting and co-adapting, and evolution is continuing. And this just doesn't go backwards. You can't stop this and make it like it once was, even if we really knew a moment in time where we had enough of a description of what was happening that we could emulate that. Typically, I think the most ironic thing about a lot of restoration efforts is that they're aiming for the zero data year. They're aiming for the time when nobody was there to even take inventory and explain, so we don't have, all we have is the idea that it was before the white guys got there.
Yeah.
And there's something to that. I mean, some substantial things really began to change at that point. On the other hand, there's just no description. Even if you could kind of force a return to those conditions somehow, which is really a fraught proposition, we don't know what they were. We just don't have them. We can draw some inferences. You can go and take pollen core samples out of lake sediments, and you can do a bunch of stuff that give you some sense of what was probably there. Of course, if you're doing lake sediment sampling and looking at pollen grains in those sediments. A lot really kind of depends on which way the wind was blowing that year, as to what might end up in the lake. So huge contingencies and caveats in all of this stuff. It's just, yeah, the idea of going back there and we're returning, the conversation itself is returning to sort of the golden age idea, is we just don't know what that was. We're just assuming that there was such a thing, and that time was right because we hadn't screwed it up yet. But it's, that's, to me, it just sounds like an impossible task, or at worst, a fool's errand to try and think that we could do that. Maybe what we need to be thinking about is kind of how to survive from where we are, which is, we kind of know a few things about that, not all of them, because it's, if I went out to do a real serious ecological survey of some place, especially a big place, by the time I got it done and reported it all, it wouldn't be like that anymore anyway. So this is tough stuff to really try to get a handle on.
Wow.
And I would just add to that in some cases, I think in the United States, and more so as we go to the West, we would have some idea of what was in a place before white people came, and that there were some there were some strong traditions in those places among the Native people, and there was their own oral tradition, there was their own stories, there were, and a lot of that's of course been fragmented, as well. But, of course, that type of knowledge of place and those kinds of inventories are generally ignored, of course, too. When you talk about untrammeled wilderness, for example, is, ignoring, those influences from before.
Right. And this brings us into a whole another realm of sort of environmental history and historical environmental justice and lots of things that are, we're going to be talking. We can podcast for a long time on just on things that we've begun to raise here, right? So I don't think we have a good sense of what kind of information might actually be out there at this, that has survived oral tradition, because the people whose oral tradition this is have been themselves sort of uprooted from contact. And so to them, instead of being lived experience, for many of them, these are stories that you can't attach, to the ground. You can't see them happening. I mean, so many people were moved to, out of the places where their traditions were formulated. It's one among many tragedies, right? That kind of play into all this.
You probably know that very thick book, Ethnobotany by Daniel J. Mormon, where he basically...
I think there's a copy of it in the house somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, it's big. It's like 800 pages.
Yeah.
It's huge, right?
Yeah,
I've got a copy of that here, fortunately. And one thing I noticed when I first went through that book and was going to the species was that there were all sorts of non-native species that were in there. And to me, I noticed that and I'm like, oh, well, new plants showed up and they found uses for them and started using them for these things. And I thought that was interesting too, just in how it sort of showed that there was a different worldview that was going on there, or that there's some of these ways of looking at things that are definitely very Western anyway. I mean, a lot of, that's being aware of our sort of Western prejudices and stuff like that is something that I think, we all need to work on. And when we're looking at all these things, scientists and non-scientists, alike.
Western, Northern, I mean,
right.
And it's, I from what I've seen, this is, again, getting back to this sort of coalition
Right.
between a big array of attitudes and understandings, and this is a sort of crazy quilt of ideas, some of which match and some of which don't, and it's too complicated to account for with a sort of simple story of any kind. Other than that, somewhere in this process of becoming civilizations, and becoming specialized, we have, as economically specialized people and stratified into the kind of complex economies that we have, most of us have really no connection personally to immediately to what's happening out on the land, and just aren't there. And even for someone who knows that and pays a lot of attention to it, I'm spending most of my time in offices talking on Zoom, instead of, so whatever I've managed to collect in my time so far may exceed the average by quite a bit. On the other hand, I can get, if I started listing the things that I don't know that I would really like to know, it would take a long time.
Yeah.
So where does that leave us?
That I've kind of gone through the things that I was curious to ask you about. Yeah.
Okay.
I could come up with more, but it just goes somewhere else.
Yeah. It's a big,
Well, we can try another day if you
Yeah.
run out of
yeah, this could be a continuing conversation. It's already been on about 3 hours. It's pretty.
Oh my gosh.
I
Okay.
noticed that. Yeah,
I didn't know what time it was.
batteries have been dying and all of this stuff. So yeah.
Well, I mean, that sounds like a good wrap right there.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, all I can say is that that's what I think, and I can't promise you that it's right, but it's the best I can come up with so far.
Yeah.
Yeah, we really appreciate you spending this time with us today. Yeah, it was really great to talk to you about these subjects.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Yeah. It's like I said, if you come up with something else that you think I can help with, let me know. But
Maybe our
otherwise,
next conversation should be about tamarisk. I'm just gonna put it out there. I just want. I want to.
Take a deep
well, I know
dive
you've
into
recently
tamarisk.
I know you've talked about tamarisk a bit, but I am involved in a National Science Foundation grant proposal right now that, if funded, is going to give us a whole big news story about tamarisk. So
Nice.
Wow.
we can, but that's not going to happen this week. That's a 4-year project if it gets funded, and so I like my co-investigators are at Texas Tech University, and they're trying to get this thing finalized and submitted.
Cool.
So we'll see. But yeah, my view of tamarisk is more historical and less ecological than Julie's. So we can, but if you've seen what I've written about it, then you already know that. But we're looking, we're finding a whole bunch of new facts, new old facts. We're finding a whole bunch more about where this stuff came from and who was distributing it and how different versions of it got to different places. So if this project gets funded, we're going to be talking about a whole bunch of genomic investigation and a whole bunch more historic digging to see how we can match up the available stories about how tamarisk was being moved around with actual genotypes on the ground. So that, which could be, really a lot of fun. And so I hope that it gets funded, because it's sort of a way to finish the project I started on the history of tamarisk introduction in the U.S.
Me too.
Cool.
I'm excited to hear
That's
more
great.
about the hybridization of different tamarisk species in the Southwest and endemic. I'm gonna say endemic
Yeah.
tamarisks that are technically native now to the
Tamarix americana.
Yeah.
Tamarix americana.
No.
There is, and there may be more than one species
Lord, don't be funny.
that exists only here, right? But we don't know yet.
Yeah.
Okay.
We don't know.
Oh.
Well, I feel very full.
That's our cliffhanger.
Yeah. I feel very full and satiated and satisfied with that conversation.
Okay.
Fun. Matt, you're great. We appreciate you taking 3 hours to do this. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much.
All you have to do to get an academic to talk to you is ask them what they're interested in. You know?
Yeah.
What do you do? Yeah. So, okay, watch out. It's coming. Right.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, we got-
Okay. Well, we'll talk to you again. Let me know.
Yeah, we'll stay in touch.
Be in touch.
Yeah.
bye.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you.
Good job.
Yeah.
That was long.
Hey, I have a question for you on your end with your Wi-Fi. Did you get any interference or any blippiness at all?
Almost none.
Oh, because I got some in different parts, so you might have the ideal record of this whole interview. I mean, I had
Probably.
more, I think I had a lot more interference than you did, which would mean more editing. So maybe,
Right. Were you recording the video on that end too?
yeah.
Okay. I'm curious to see what that looks like. You can, I not necessarily you'll need to send it to me, but maybe you can watch a bit and tell me what it looks like, because I started off in one mode and went to a different mode here. And so I'm interested in what actually got recorded. I'm still figuring out what Zoom records for you, you know, like how it does it, you know, like it,
Basically, it was like a triangle, like both of us were in
right.
Boom, and then me, and then that, and then Matt. But then when that woman was with us, it was like the screen was basically divided into 4 blocks.
Yeah. Yeah. And see, I was in that mode, and then I went into the speaker mode where he would then be big on the screen. And then there was 3 little screens,
Yeah.
you know, and I'll see, it'll be interesting to see like what Zoom did with that. You know what I mean? Like how it records.